Welcome back. We are going to carry on with our little Space Marine guy here, trying to get into level 2. And I think level 2 for me is just going to be focusing on basic shading and highlighting. And so what we're going to do is try and focus on the metallic areas, try and get a little bit of shade in there, and then highlight some of the detail. Similarly on the metallics on his armor, we will try and get a little bit of highlight and shade on there, and then obviously a little bit of kind of classic edge highlighting. And there's a nice little trick I can show you with edge highlighting, because if you're not particularly precise with your brush control, you're going to get a little bit of a wavier line, maybe a thick blotch of the highlight paint, and I think that can sometimes be frustrating, but actually it's a bit of an opportunity, because what we can do kind of level 3 wise is that might help us turn it into a little bit of battle damage. So I'll show you that when we get to what I think. I think these are arbitrary, right? Again, like I said before, I don't know how many levels there are, but that level 3 probably includes a little bit of battle damage and chipping and things on his armor. So we're not going to worry too much if we make slight mistakes with that edge highlighting. So we'll see how that goes. I'm going to use a lighter blue in this case, fairly kind of standard, I suppose. Over Macragge blue is the Calgar blue, a nice lighter blue, and then we're going to use Nuln Oil over the silver metallics, the lead belcher, and I'm going to use Fyreslayer Flesh, which has a slightly red tint to it, I suppose, over the golds. And then highlighting those metallics, I've got the Auric Armor Gold, which is a really light, bright gold, and Stormhost Silver. So let's see how we get on with those. Let's start then with the Nuln Oil. Nice and straightforward. And we're going to put this, give it a good shake, and you can kind of soak your brush in it, really. We don't need to put it on the wet palette, we don't need to thin it, because it's already a kind of a shade paint, so it's very thin, very easy to apply. And we're just going to wash this in, and you can already see there on that kind of little vent part that he's got on his weapon, as the shade paint sits into those little recesses, it makes them stand out. Again, like I said in level 1, we're trying to increase contrast more, and I don't know why I shut the lid on that, we're going to need some more of it. And this, having this sit in the recesses on his weapon here, as we go into that bit, you can see he just starts to highlight some of those little buttons and raised bits that he's got on his gun, right? So the only thing we're trying to do is make sure we don't have massive blobs that fit in the middle of panels, in the middle of sections, and the most of the paint is going to come off where you lift your brush off. So you want to try and lift your brush off at the bottom of the panels or in the recesses, just to kind of drag it around. Doesn't matter too much though, because we're going to go back over it and give it a good highlight as well. Let's just cover all of the silver bits with that, and we mustn't forget obviously around the back. On his backpack he's got those nice little vents in there. They're going to look pretty good when we put the shade vent in there. You see that just kind of highlights those little kind of vent shapes. Nothing special here, right? But just adds to that. There you go, and it just sits nicely inside the little, I don't know what they are really, I suppose, little additional exhausts or some kind of down vent. And that's all we're going to do with the Nuln Oil. Sometimes I think people are encouraged to kind of like put it all over the blue, and the problem with acrylic paint is when it's dry, that's it. There's nothing you can do to manipulate it. So for me, it's like if you were going to put it on the model directly, you want to try and get it in those recesses, like round there under the knee, round on top of the boot, those kind of things. We're not going to do that today, but that is definitely something you can do as a further enhancement. You just need to be careful where it spills over onto the panel. I think the idea was you cover it in Nuln Oil and then you repaint all the panels, leaving the shade, in the recesses where you want it. But frankly, that's quite a lot of work, and there are better ways to do that. And again, we can look at that in future levels, probably better materials that we can use to achieve that effect. So we're not going to worry too much about that. Right, I think that's it for our, oh no, he's got these little headphones, I don't know what they are, little ear pods on the side. Maybe they're how his helmet locks down into the armour. Anyway, they need a little bit of paint on there. The Fire Slayer fresh, give it a good shake. This is quite an old one, so it's alright. Yeah, it's okay. And we are going to thin this down a little bit because it's a contrast paint. So I'm going to put a little bit on my wet palette. Good. So I'm going to add a little bit of water, like I said, to that. So this was just a dog interlude because the postman turned up. And really kind of thin that down so that, I love doing this. First time I've done this. This is all definitely high profile YouTubing, right? You want that kind of, see how even it sits into the kind of little creases in my hand. That's probably a little bit too thick. I'm going to add a little bit more water. Really kind of wash it down. Maybe this consistency, just so it's like we're trying to emulate there. Yeah, that's better. Trying to emulate that shade paint consistency. I just quite like the tone. I mean, you could use something like another shade paint or Agrex Earthshade or something like that, I suppose, if you wanted to. And we're just going to put this all over the brassy bits and the gold bits. Now, we can slap it on when it comes to the gun muzzle and the Promethium tank, because it's going to sit nicely when we drag it in there. It's just going to sit nicely in all the little recesses that connect around near the kind of silver pipes that we've got on there. And it doesn't matter if it goes on the silver because we can re-highlight them. But when we're coming to do the gold on his armor, we want to have a think about if we put it onto the Aquila. See, if I push it up, I can get it to just sit in the creases of the feathers of the Aquila, and particularly under that kind of thicker bit at the top. I can just pull it up under there and it just runs nicely into all the bits that we want to shade. See, I think that looks quite nice. And on these corners of his pauldrons, I want to pull it down so that the final bit of the paint is on the corner of his pauldron. You could choose, I suppose, to pull it into the middle if you wanted that kind of contrast to sit there. I'm going to choose arbitrarily today, I suppose, to pull it down into that corner and just have it sitting in the bottom part of each of his pauldrons. Which means, you've probably worked out by now, that when we do the little highlight, we're going to focus on having it on the middle section. You could switch it the other way around. I suppose sometimes people like to have that kind of nice sharp corner with the highlight on the corner. That works, of course, why not? I'm just deciding to do it the other way today, no problem. There we go. So that's our shade. We're just going to give it a little moment to dry. If you need to pull some more in there, you can. You could put another layer on if you want. Whatever works for you. Particularly if you're not happy with how it's sitting in some of the recesses, the gaps where you want to create the shadow. Pull some more into that corner. Okay, and that's all we're going to do for our shading. Okay, while that's drying, we can then have a look a little bit about the edge highlighting. So we're going to use the Calgar blue, and we can start on bits away from where we're waiting our shade paint to dry. Again, I want to get a little bit, so I've gone for a slightly smaller brush, but with a long tip, because we want to be able to run this along the edges of our model. So if I'm trying to highlight along the edge of his helmet, I want to be able to kind of drag the edge of the brush along the sharpest edge of the model of his armor. And again, for level 2, We don't need to do every single item, which of course takes us quite a bit of skill to do. And look, here's another little bit of detail on the back of his legs where you could kind of like very carefully insert some Nuln Oil in there to highlight those if you wanted to, rather than sloshing it over the whole panel and then having to repaint the panels the blue. You could, with a nice thin brush, just kind of try and run it in there and then fix any mistakes or overspill. We're not going to do that today. Like I say, we're just keeping it very high level shading, get it onto the main bits, and you can see now as it's drying we're getting some nice contrast in those little shadow areas, and we're going to brighten up those panels a little bit with some highlighting when we get to that point. So let's have a look at a little part of the blue. I'm only going to do one or two. Let's get some onto our wet palette, add a little bit of water just to keep it smooth. You'll find a lot of these Citadel paints, even if they're all layer or all base, vary significantly in terms of thickness, and so you need to play it by paint as to how much water you're going to add. And I like, just sometimes it's just a little touch because you want that paint to be smooth but not runny, and then take some off of your brush and just kind of like trying to get the right amount on my brush here. That should be okay. Trying to get it to the point where I can focus on a little edge and maybe get some highlighting going. So we're going to just go along that top section of his helmet, go along the front, try and get the right angle that you want, run it along there. I'm just trying to lightly hit the side of my brush as I go through. Now it goes down behind his head, and like I said, we don't need to try and poke the brush all the way in. If we can, great. If not, we're going to leave it. And so that's really a good example of what we're trying to achieve. And we can go around the model and do as much or as little of that as we like. This nice panel down the side of the leg here is an easy one to do. You can just kind of run it down there. Now I want to make a little bit of a deliberate error somewhere so I can demonstrate later on what I meant about the battle damage piece. So we might do it here. So if I was going to go, and then I went a little bit too thick because I got my brush angle there, you can see that bit. We can use that to our advantage later on. So I've worked my way all the way around the model, highlighting the bits that I want to highlight in the blue. And to start with, for level 2, I'm really just going to be focusing on obvious edges, like on his little side panel here. You can go along the bottom of his bit that falls under the pouches at the back, go along the side, very obvious areas. If I try to get into the top of here, that's going to take me a little more time and skill to kind of get in there with the brush control. Maybe I'm not going to do it this time for the level 2. Just work my way around and get those done. Okay. So we'll do that in our own time. Let's move on to the highlighting piece to bring back some of the shininess that we want on our metallics. And I'll just start with the obvious one because I think we've got the Leadbelcher and the Nuln Oil in there, and then I'm just going to use a little bit of Stormhost Silver, which is really lovely. It's a nice bright paint, quite gelatinous, so you can get away with, a little bit like Leadbelcher actually, you can get away with adding fairly significant amount of water, but not so much that you thin it to the point where it doesn't cover properly. And be careful you take some off of your brush to be able to do this. Okay, so now when we come back in here, we've got this nice line coming down from the handle. Just going to apply, and you see how bright it is. Nice, looks great. And then this button, I can actually pick out the full face of this button if I wanted to. There's another one just underneath. And you just see how it brings that metal back to life with the contrast. So we've got the Nuln Oil underneath, and we've got the nice bright Let's try and put one right along the top here. Nice. And maybe down this side. Just got to be gentle with your brush technique. Maybe a little bit of highlight on the outside of those little connector cables. Sometimes all we're looking to do is put a little blob or a little touch. We don't have to go all the way around. No, we're just trying to pick out something that can help us with the contrast. So we just go on the side of here, maybe a little bit at the bottom there, like that. And again, we can work our way around as much or as little. And maybe I've gone a little bit over the edge there, but like I say, again, that can help us later on with another little effect. And as an amateur, I think it's quite nice to be able to find a way to use your mistakes, if they are that. No, it doesn't have to be a mistake. If you like it, then it's good. But if I was trying to be very precise with those thin highlights, and I've gone over a little bit here and deliberately went over a little bit there with the blue, it's nice to have a way of being able to use that to your advantage. And I do have one trick that I can show you next time. So when we get to level 3, we can really pick that up. Don't forget these vents. These are quite nice to highlight because they're nice and square on the back. You can just pick out each edge if you wanted to, go all the way around. And we're leaving that null oil sitting inside the vent to give us the depth, if that's what we want to call it. And we can go do it, let's say, as much or as little as you like. We're just running that brush over the edges. Same with the, and this works quite nicely on these vents. I think it really adds something to them. Actually, throw my brush away. So where you've got these circular bits on the back, look at that. That's really nice. Just lifts the rim of those vents away from the null oil underneath. Just got to be a little bit careful you don't get any inside the thing. So I'm just trying to tilt the model so that it's flat and then running the edge of my brush around it. And I think that's really nice. Look, you get the dark recess and you get the nice bright rim on the outside. And that's maybe something that will not really be noticed because obviously they're pointing down, but you know it's there, you know it enhances how your model looks. And I think that's it. That would be me for the level 2. I haven't done all the blue highlighting, but I think you understand what I'm getting at. I'll do that in my own time now and come back. And like I say, we'll have a look at some tips and tricks for things like battle damage, scratches, dirt, some environmental things that we can put on the model to take him to level 3. Thanks very much for joining me again, and I will see you next week probably. Have a good week. See you soon. Bye.